Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Tomczyk at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar. Before we get started, just a reminder, we are recording this for future use and also live streaming it on Facebook. Additionally, we hope to make today's webinar as conversational as possible, so we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We're going to dive right into today's webinar. I'm sure many of you saw over the holidays, Congress passed another COVID relief package. And I thought since it was passed in the middle of all the holiday melee, now would be a really good time to just take a step back and look at what it did and where else we may be going in terms of COVID relief legislation. And to help walk us through this, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Marc Goldwein, who is the Senior Vice President at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He's no stranger to any of you who routinely tune into our webinars. So Marc, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I guess the first question I would have for you before you dive into your presentation is maybe just a brief refresher. What happened at the end of the year and what did Congress do?
Yeah, so let me try to share my screen, which those of you that have done these webinars know is always the most awkward part. I understand this is not the most important thing going on this week by far, but for those who remember 2020, which now seems like a lifetime ago, at the very end of the year, Congress passed and President Trump ultimately signed quite a large package. A package that did many things. Mainly, it was an end-of-year appropriations package, not a continuing resolution, but actually a new omnibus appropriations that funded kind of every part of government for the rest of fiscal year 2021. It had about 670 billion of defense spending, 630 billion of non-defense, another 70, and this is not counting some of the bits and pieces, so the numbers may look a little different to you, but about 70 billion, 80 billion from OCO, some emergency spending, some cap adjustments for things like that. But the bottom line is this bill is mostly just your run-of-the-mill, I think well executed, well negotiated among the Appropriations Committee omnibus bill. But it was also so much more. Included in it was an over $900 billion COVID relief bill. That was a combination of stimulus and kind of relief and other measures, a tax extenders package, including various new tax breaks, and a bunch of other provisions from banning surprise billing to changing the way that Pell Grants work. This is a very big package. We are not going to dive into all parts of the package. What I'm going to focus on here is what we've been focusing on a lot of these webinars, which is the part of the bill we're calling the Response and Relief Act. Now, we take a bit of liberties. The Response and Relief Act, we are basically covering in this any part that's related to COVID relief, or that was an extension of something from the prior COVID relief basis. Some of these are technically in another title of the bill, although most of them are in the section associated with response and relief. And this was a big package. We are still waiting for an official CBO score to most parts of it, so I can't tell you definitively quite how big it was, but our estimates is it was about $935 billion. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes down a little bit with the CBO score, but we're in the range of $900 billion. The largest section by far, I shouldn't say by far, but the largest section by a significant amount was support to small businesses. Many of you remember in the CARES Act and subsequent extension, we had the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave basically 10 weeks worth of payroll to almost any small business that felt like they could possibly need the money. This bill creates a second draw to that program, so businesses can go back and get a second loan. The second loan is a lot more restrictive than the first loan. First of all, it can only go to businesses who have experienced a revenue loss of 25% or more in any quarter, and who still feel like they have need. You know, a lot of small businesses thought they were going to be suffering back in March and April, but after the initial, shelter-in-place orders ended, those small businesses recovered and are doing fine right now. In some cases, they've been quite well. They won't be eligible for the PPP. But other businesses that are continue to struggle will be. They also lowered the thresholds from 500 employees to 300 employees, so it can't be quite as large businesses. And they lowered the maximum award from 10 million to to $2 million. So it's a second PPP. I should also say to really focus on the restaurant industry. Most small businesses can get 10 weeks. The restaurant industry can get 14 weeks, 14 or 15 weeks worth of payroll. So they will get more. They're the ones we expect to kind of suffer the most during this winter period because they were really counting on outdoor dining. But unless you're in southern Florida or a few warm parts of the country, that's not so easy to do in January, February. There are also other expansions and extensions of various small business programs, including a new program for basically venues, concert venues and performers and things like that, shows, as well as a change in tax law that said that the PPP loans essentially don't count as income, and the money you spend it on does count as a business expense. And so this is kind of actually a very large tax break for businesses that took the PPP. That was the largest part of this package, but there are lots of other parts. There's about $80 billion worth of spending on education. People may remember back in December, there was a big fight over whether there'd be state and local aid or not. And the parties basically agreed, we're not going to do direct state and local aid in this package. And we're also not going to do liability insurance, which were the things that Democrats and Republicans wanted. But there is some indirect state and local aid. The biggest part of it is there's $54 billion. Depending on how you measure it, there's almost $60 billion that essentially goes to local governments for K through 12 education. And so that's money that otherwise would come out of state and local budgets. And so that really is an indirect state and local aid. There's also more money for colleges and things like that. In addition, I'm going to go out of order a little bit, just to show you some of the other money for state and localities. We also gave money for states and localities to their highway programs and to their transit programs, another about $25 billion there. On top of that, we had another airline support program, so airlines that have furloughed their workers can bring them back again. A lot of money spent on healthcare. We now have, very excitingly, 2 successful vaccines, 2 or 3 successful vaccines, depending, 2 that are approved in the United States, and maybe more on their way, but not enough money to allocate all of these vaccines at a pace. So this legislation included about $70 billion of health spending. Most of it was for COVID treatment and vaccine disbursement, procurement, et cetera, and for testing and tracing of COVID. We extended unemployment benefits. I apologize for doing the laundry list, but I want you to also hear that also in it, everything that's in it. You may remember, going back to the CARES Act, there was a period of time that we not only expanded unemployment benefits to gig workers and self-employed, but we also increased benefits by $600 per week. That $600 per week long expired bonus, and the expansion of unemployment, both the number of weeks and to gig workers, was about to expire at the end of last year. We extended the expansion to gig workers. We expanded the extra weeks, basically to be 50 weeks into mid-March, in some cases into early April. And we added a $300 a week supplement for the next 11 weeks. So that's not as big as the 600, but a 300 week supplement is enough so that the typical person on unemployment is making about what they were making in their salary on unemployment. It looks to me like it's a slightly less, but this is sort of average replacement. We also sent everyone $600 per person checks, which I'll get more into later. The first round of CARES Act, we sent almost everyone, $1,200 per adult, $500 per kids. So this is less per adult, but it's actually more per child. That was about $170 billion. And then there's lots of other stuff in this package. I mentioned the airline money. There's money for Amtrak, which President-elect Biden, I know, is going to be very excited about because he loves riding Amtrak. Expansion of food stamps. We're actually increasing the amount of food stamps, which is going to help a lot of low-income families. $25 billion for states to offer rental assistance, money for broadband, support for the post office, kind of a lot of bits and pieces, and some new tax breaks and expansion tax breaks, including more support to small businesses who retain their workers through a much expanded employee retention tax credit. The basic rule going forward is if you're a small business that has experienced some revenue loss, you can get a tax credit of up to $7,000 per worker per quarter for the first half of the year. So that's up to $14,000 worth of tax credits per worker, so long as it's not money that's coming out of PPP. So Even for businesses that have PPP, there's an ability to get some of both, and this can be additional small business relief if you keep your workers, especially for small businesses that are suffering that don't take PPP. And there's a bunch of other stuff, including, frankly, some not so smart ideas, like, in my opinion, like making business meals 100% deduction. It has not been 100% deductible since the 1986 tax reform. Tax reform for the last 30 years has been moving in the direction of eliminating this deduction. This fully restores it in 2021 and 2022. We also create a new charitable deduction on top of the existing deduction, which kind of goes opposite tax reform. So it's not all, not all maybe targeted COVID relief and good stuff, but if you look at this package as a whole, it is pretty targeted at the problem. And, I think that's one thing that happens when you land on a package that's $900 billion as opposed to the, $3.5 trillion we've been talking about some points, is that, you have to target it more to where the money is really needed. So even though the COVID relief package, I think, was very well targeted with a few exceptions, not perfect, but kind of well for the job, the Omnibus also included some other stuff that was not very well targeted at all. And I just can't help but point out that we included 135 billion tax cuts that have nothing to do with COVID, that really have nothing to do with the Omnibus. And some of them were good policies, some of them were bad policies, but none of them were paid for on this bill. In other words, we spent more on tax breaks, mostly for businesses, than we did on unemployment benefits, for example. And if you go through the list, some of it is extending things that we'd already agreed, we should limit from Obamacare and from TCJA, like the medical expense deduction, like the tax preference for racetracks and for race horses. Other stuff is extenders that, they do want to keep extending, but again, unpaid for. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to fetch a little bit that this really had no place in the overall package. This was just another excuse to cut taxes by an additional $135 billion, which seems to be an annual tradition in Congress that sadly both parties participate in. So let's go back to the COVID relief bill, which is really the point here. With this new $900 billion bill, by our estimates, there is about $3.4 trillion of total net COVID relief. I say net because there's actually a lot more than that in loans and tax deferrals, but it's going to be paid back. So this is a deficit impact number. We're actually about $4.5 trillion of total support at a deficit impact of $3.4 trillion. All but 15 billion of it comes from these 4 pieces of legislation. So this chart here we're missing 15 billion, but this chart includes all the major COVID relief. You can see that, the most recent bill, the Response and Relief Act, is 935, the second largest, about half the size of the original CARES Act. But if you also kind of look at where the money's going, almost $1 trillion of this money has gone to small business, over $1 trillion if you count their tax relief. Another roughly $1 trillion has gone to households, directly to households, either through unemployment benefits that go specifically to households where someone has lost their job, or recovery rebates that have gone more broadly. Actually a little bit over $1 trillion. But we spent about $400 billion on healthcare spending, including money for healthcare providers, but also for testing and for vaccine development and things like that. There's been, despite the fact that we kind of keep saying there's no state and local aid, we've actually spent we've allocated almost $350 billion to state and local aid through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, through money for public schools, transit, a boost in existing Medicaid benefits. This does not count money where the states are merely flow through. This is aid to the state and local governments. And then there's the other stuff, which is significant, but didn't rise to the level of making it into this chart. With all this added up, we have now spent more on COVID relief than we spent during the Great Recession. Prior to this, it was about even as a share of GDP. In fact, the Great Recession response is a little bit larger. But now, over a 5-year period, we estimate COVID relief is going to cost about 3% of GDP, compared to the 2.5% of GDP in total relief during the Great Recession. And the difference also is a lot more stark when you say look over time. Now, the COVID recession is a much sharper recession than the Great Recession. The Great Recession kind of took 2 years almost to get started, and then perpetuated for 6 years, whereas the worst part of the COVID recession by far was over by June, even though it's still quite bad. But that's reflected in the stimulus as well. almost all of the COVID spending enacted so far, on net, all of it will be spent in the first 2 years, whereas it took us 6 years, 5 years during the Great Recession to spend, almost as much money. So this is much more front-loaded than the Great Recession. The overall effect, we think, is going to be very strong on personal income. We know what happened historically, between the first quarter and second quarter of last year. In other words, from before the crisis to the worst part of the crisis, GDP fell 10%. Market income fell a similar amount. Over that same period, personal incomes actually rose 10%. That's really unprecedented. In one quarter, personal income rose 10%, while GDP fell 10%. It did come down a bit in the second quarter, and we think in the third quarter, and we think in the fourth quarter by our projections. But with this new stimulus, we now expect income this year to be the highest it's ever been, 13% above pre-COVID levels. That 13% year-over-year growth is about 3 times as large as typical growth in personal income. In a typical year, income will grow 4, maybe 5%. Again, we're expecting 13% growth. Some of this is one-time checks, and so without more stimulus, we'll start to come down again. But we're probably at the point in the economic cycle in the pandemic that we can be relatively confident, unless something really bad happens, personal income is never going to have fallen below pre-COVID levels. We've kind of secured overall income, which is good news. The other good news is we think this is going to provide a boost to the economy. The economy, which had a pretty strong snapback from the worst parts of the COVID crisis, was starting to fall back into what potentially could have been a shallow double dip. The combination of the rapid spread of the virus and the cold weather making it harder to adapt, and the expiration of fiscal stimulus meant that there was the potential, and we may have seen some in December, but potential for a serious slump in the winter months, December, January, February, March. We no longer expect that with the COVID relief. By our estimates, which I think are relatively conservative, we think that the $930 billion spent, 35 spent on COVID relief, is going to boost GDP by about 600 billion, more than 600 billion, which, by the way, is equivalent to what we think the full output gap is in 2021. In other words, there's enough COVID relief here to close the entire difference between how big the economy should be in 2021 and how big it would have been because of the recession. And we don't actually think that it's all going to happen in 2021. The economic effect is going to disperse over time. And there's really no scenario 2021 could be kind of a normal economic year, because as long as we're social distancing, as long as restaurants are at 25% internal capacity, we'll never have a full economy. But the point is, this is big enough to restore the equivalent of all of our losses in 2021. That's a big deal. In our base case scenario, it'll actually, in total, restore about 3/4 of what we're going to lose in 2021, and about 1/5 of what we're going to lose for the next few years after that. In our more optimistic scenario, this package by itself is actually enough to get the economy to the point where it can recover on its own, to basically get the economy back to where the combination of the warmer weather and immunity, hopefully mostly from vaccines, can and all the savings we have can help the economy to get back to its full potential self relatively quickly without more stimulus overall. Even in our pessimistic scenario, this is going to be enough to prevent a double dip recession. So we think this package is going to make a meaningful and large difference to the economy. And there's talk about expanding it. I think that in particular, President Trump has called for the checks in this last bill of rebates to be 2,000 instead of 600. In light of, and Democrats have agreed and put forward legislation to do just that. In light of their election results in Georgia, I assume this is going to be high on the Biden administration's agenda to get these checks boosted. If they enact the legislation that's already passed the House called the Cash Act, what that would do is it would boost the $600 payments that are already existing to $1,400, and also expand eligibility to adult dependents, people that aren't children but don't have their own income as effectively. By our estimates in JCTs, this would cost about $460 billion, bringing the total cost of rebates in this round to 630. It would boost income if it happened this quarter to 25% above pre-COVID levels, which is really quite astronomical, considering that we'll be lucky to get GDP at pre-COVID levels. And we estimate it'll boost GDP by another $300 billion, which is very significant, although that will be spread out mainly in 2021, mainly later 2023. Just a little bit more on this to kind of, this is a great table my colleague John put together that just kind of shows you the difference between the original CARES Act rebates, the response and relief rebates, and the Cash Act, which would be a big boost and a big boost in overall cost. Not only is it more expensive, but is going to go to higher income people. The reason is that the phase out built into the Cash Act and built into all the rebates is based on 5% of your income above a threshold. So the bigger your rebates are, the longer it takes to phase out. With the Cash Act, if we have the $2,000 checks, we'll be sending a family of 5 $10,000. That is a lot of money, but it also takes a lot of money to phase out $10,000. If you start phasing it out at 150,000 of income, you're still making payments up until a family makes $350,000 of income. And so one challenge here that policymakers have is that if they just enact the Cash Act as is, they'll be giving a decent amount of money to families higher up the income ladder, ones that they may not be intending to target with this bill. I don't think we should pretend this is a regressive policy. It's still the case that if you're in the top 1%, you're not going to get checks. There's a $20 average here because, there's like one person in the top 1% that has 50 kids and qualifies. But in general, if you're in the top 1%, you're not going to be getting checks. If you're in the top 5%, you're probably getting a lot less. So it's not as if this is still a progressive policy overall, but it is allocating a decent amount of resources to people that have experienced no job loss and some that are comfortably in the top half and even in the top 10% of the income ladder, and in some cases higher up. So what does this all mean for the deficit? It's going to be higher. That shouldn't be a surprise. We don't know yet. We're hoping that CBO is going to score at the end of the year, but here's our best estimate, our best guess. Back in September, CBO thought the deficit for 2021 would be $1.8 trillion, 8.5% of GDP. Since then, two major things have happened. First of all, the economy is doing much better than we thought it was going to. Their economic forecasts were back from July. Back in July, things looked a lot more glim. And on top of that, this package is going to boost the economy further. So we expect a stronger economy. That's going to reduce deficits. We think that'll reduce deficits by about $250 billion. On the other hand, we have this COVID relief bill and the tax extenders. We think that they're going to increase deficits in 2021 by about $750 billion. I know they cost about $1 trillion total, but some of those costs are in 2022 and beyond. So when we kind of add those together, our best guess is that the deficit this year is going to be $2.3 trillion, a little bit over 10% of GDP. That would be the highest deficit as a share of GDP in modern history, other than 2020's deficit, be higher than the worst years of the Great Recession. These estimates come with a high degree of uncertainty. We look forward to CBO having better estimates, but they're a start. Regardless, it's pretty clear that we are on a very high debt path. Our debt is already larger than the size of the economy. It's probably headed, these are old projections. We said it's headed for 109% of current law. Just this $1 trillion package, now you need to kind of boost that to 112 or so. And that's, don't have to boost it that high because it's 25 trillion GDP, but maybe 111 and a half, 111 or so. But if there's more stimulus and more efforts to add to the debt, it could get even worse to this 120% or beyond. And so we still have this long-term debt situation we have to deal with. And I don't think I don't think there are very many economists out there who think now is the right time to be trying to reduce deficits. The economy still needs federal borrowing, and there's a lot of families out there that are hurting. We're in a pandemic, and it's worth it to borrow from the future to address this pandemic. But our long-term debt trajectory is even more unsustainable than it was before, and low interest rates aren't going to save us from that if you look at this picture. So sorry to end on a pessimistic note, but I'm actually not going to, because I'm going to end on a self-promoting note, which is check out covidmoneytracker.org. We are still working to update this for the newest numbers, incorporating the latest bill. But this is where we're doing our ongoing tracking of everything that's happening from legislation, from the Federal Reserve, from administrative actions. And we're excited to keep doing that and to follow this money and see where it goes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And just to let everyone know, we'll be sending out a video of this webinar and a link to COVID Money Tracker tomorrow in the follow-up materials. So we'll make sure that everyone gets a link to it. Mark, I'm going to dive right in, and I guess we have a bunch of questions. You talked a lot about, well, you talked some about what we could see under a potential Biden administration, the idea of going back to the $2,000 checks. Ed writes in and says, if further relief efforts are made to pass additional economic relief legislation, would it be feasible for Democrats to consider using the budget reconciliation process to do so? And what are the practical hurdles to using reconciliation for this process? So I guess even before we get that, maybe a good reminder, I know certainly for myself, would be, what is reconciliation?
This is a great question. So ordinarily in the Senate, because of the filibuster, you really need 60 votes to get anything done. And it's not impossible. They got way more than 60 votes for the most recent recovery and relief bill. I forget what they got in the Senate, but it was 90 some votes, right? So they had a bipartisan, Benny going to correct me in the right number. They had bipartisan agreement for major relief, but Democrats are now going to be in control of all three houses of Congress, the House, the Senate, and the White House. The Senate with a 50-50 majority, that's all you need if you have the vice presidency. And so rather than trying for more COVID relief on a bipartisan basis, they have the option of trying on a partisan basis. And the advantage to that is effectively they don't have to give as much, and they'll be able to get more relative to what they want, because they still have to negotiate with themselves. They still need every Democrat in the Senate to stay together, and almost every one in the House. But they could do a bill that's more to their liking. How do you do that? Through something called budget reconciliation. Budget reconciliation is a rule within the budget that basically lets you say, when you write a budget, the Congress writes a budget to say, we are giving a committee instructions to spend up to this amount. And so long as they follow those instructions, they don't need, it's filibuster proof. They don't need 60 votes. They only need a slim majority, a strict majority, 50 votes plus the vice president. And so what Democrats could do is first they could dust off the last year's budget, which was never passed, fiscal year 2021, and they could pass that, and they could pass that with reconciliation instructions. Those instructions could say, for example, the Finance Committee shall develop up to $1 trillion of new stimulus. And the new stimulus part doesn't matter. The Finance Committee can do whatever it wants, but the $1 trillion does matter, because at that point, the Senate Finance Committee could come up with a package of up to $1 trillion. There's different ways to write the instructions, whether it's spending or revenue or deficit, but the point remains, if they come up with that package, it could then be put to the Senate floor, and it does not need a supermajority, it just needs 50 votes. Now, a big question is, what can you use reconciliation for? Because there's a lot of rules. You can't use it for things that are not related to the budget. They're not budget germane. So you can't really change a lot of regulations, for example. And you can't use it for policies that would add to the deficit outside of the budget resolution window, which has historically been 10 years. So you can't do, say, permanent new spending that's not paid for. But it actually fits pretty well. And you also can't make changes to Social Security, I should mention. But it actually fits pretty well for most of this COVID relief. For things like checks, you send those all out in the first year. They're going to have no effect on 2031. Expanded unemployment benefits, I think that, I think the $2,000 checks is of interest because it kind of got political salience. But the real deadline we're facing, next deadline we're facing, is the expanded unemployment benefits are going to expire on a sort of a phased out period between mid-March and mid-April. And so they could absolutely use reconciliation to expand those. They could do reconciliation for more spending in a bunch of areas. They can even use it for things like infrastructure spending. That's a little more complicated because they have to change some of the classifications. They have to do it in a different kind of way, but they can use it for that. And so I do expect that there's going to likely to be a reconciliation bill that of which COVID relief and or economic recovery measures / stimulus is a major part.
Thanks, Mark. We have a bunch of questions about aid to small businesses. Julian writes in, he says, when you talk about aid to businesses, what are the explicit criteria the businesses need to satisfy? He says there really aren't businesses that are going to turn down money. And the example he cites is, there's a difference between a restaurant that has had to close because of COVID versus a developer that is still, developing and building and everything. Is there anything to account for that difference in terms of need?
This is a great question. So the first round of the Paycheck Protection Program was kind of by the honor code. It's a little more complicated, but you basically just had to say, I think that I could be in trouble because of COVID. You weren't allowed to lie. You could be investigated for fraud, but you just had to have a reasonable sense that you could be losing money. And there were, I think, a lot of businesses that took PPP the first round that really genuinely thought COVID was really going to hurt their business, and it ended up either hurting them on the margins or not really hurting them very much at all after all. This time, the criteria is stricter. It's not super strict, but it's stricter in a few ways. First of all, I do expect a similar kind of certification. The SBA is still writing the rules, but I think it may be hard for a business that is seeing their revenue basically having already returned to pre-COVID levels to apply, because it's going to be hard for them to argue they're struggling. So there is going to be another type of self-certification. I think this one will be stricter, but we're waiting for the rules. But on top of that self-certification, you now need to have proof that you have revenue loss. And so the general rule is you need to show there was a quarter in 2020 that your revenue was 25% lower than the equivalent time in 2019. And there are variations on this rule for things like seasonal employment and stuff like that, but that's the general rule. You need to show 25% as revenue loss. The second rule is once you get the money, you need to spend at least 60% of it on your employees, on wages and salaries and things that are related to that. And you need to have ultimately hired back or retained all of your employees. Now, if you don't lose the money, but what happens is some of it becomes a loan. So it's given to you as kind of a loan. As long as you follow those things I just said, it all becomes forgiven and it's a grant. But if you can't hire back all your employees, you can't spend as much of that on wages, then some portion of it you will ultimately have to pay back. That's the basic rules. For the employer retention credit, it's a little bit different. The criteria is essentially at 20% instead of 25% revenue loss, and there's caps on quarterly income, and there's all sorts of other intricate rules, but that's the basic idea. I will say we can't really differentiate. The legislation does not differentiate between a business that has lost 80% of its income and a business that's lost 30%. Those do look the same in the eye of PPP, other than to some degree, the bigger loss might have less of a tax obligation.
Mark, I'm going to continue on the PPP thought train here. Randy writes in, are the tax deductibility provisions eligible for first draw PPP borrowers, or is deductibility only for second draw borrowers?
So here's the situation. Normally, when a business gets income from almost any source, gets money from almost any source, that counts as income and is taxable. But when a business spends money on almost anything that's business relevant, that becomes a deduction. It isn't taxable. The business tax is a net tax. It taxes your revenue minus your expenses. The original PPP explicitly said your PPP does not count as revenue, but the IRS determined that what that meant is that the money you spend from PPP doesn't count as expenses either. This legislation says that for both the first and the second PPP, the money you spend from PPP does count as expenses. So you get to deduct the spending, even though you don't have to count the money as revenue. So it's essentially as if the PPP is giving you tax-free aid.
Mark, want to ask, we're going to stay on the aid to businesses. Joanne writes in and says, what if you're self-employed and you are paying yourself from lost income? How does that work?
So self-employed folks have two options. It's the same as the CARES Act. Your one option is if you've effectively lost your ability to make money, or make substantial money, you can apply for unemployment. And even though people aren't usually eligible for unemployment, they're self-employed, something called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program does make you eligible for the full unemployment benefits in your state, which is usually comparable to regular employment benefits, sometimes a little bit lower, plus $300. If you are self-employed and you effectively are still working full-time, or if you're not and you choose this route, you can apply for the PPP, and the money that you were dispersing to yourself based on your effectively based on your 2019 tax return. It's a little more complicated, but that's the basic idea. Counts as wage income. And so self-employed sole proprietors can apply for PPP.
Mark asked, do nonprofits such as 501c3s, 4s, and 6s qualify for the employee retention tax credit because of this?
I would have to check to confirm. I believe that they do. I believe they're eligible for the employee retention tax credit if their revenue is down 20%. There may be some exceptions if they're involved in lobbying activities or if they are somehow connected to the government of China. So I'd have to check. You should talk to a tax lawyer, but I believe that they are eligible if their revenue is down or if their funds are down by 20%.
Cynthia asks about rental relief funds, and I know that a big part of this bill and the momentum to get it done, there was also a whole other debate about the eviction moratorium. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there were two deadlines that were supposed to be at December 31st that people were really panicked about besides the unemployment. One was an eviction moratorium, which was basically put in place by the CDC, and it wasn't even clear how binding it was, but it was working because a lot of, landlords didn't want to risk it. And it basically said you can't really evict someone except for in a very rare few cases for a period of time. And the other was no one's paying student loan forbearance. No one's paying back their student loans right now, and you don't have to pay any, and you don't accrue any interest for not paying it back. The Trump administration extended that student loan forbearance to January 31st. This bill extended the eviction moratorium to January 31st. That, in both cases, is really signaling this is Joe Biden's problem. Okay, that's basically the lesson of both those things. There's an assumption that that President-elect Biden will ultimately extend these further through administrative action, but it's an assumption at this point. We don't have, it's not on paper, and it can't be until he is in office.
Dan Schoenfeld writes in and asks about what he says, when can we expect a higher federal tax bill to pay for this? And I guess this is also a good time to pivot and say, you ended the presentation with, we're still going to have a debt situation after this, and now's not the time to focus on the debt. Now's the time to focus on addressing the pandemic. But it does raise a good question about where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those physics things where no particular thing you do makes a big difference, but everything you do together does. There's no need to pay for any particular stimulus legislation because it's kind of one-time stuff, and it just one-time adds to the debt, and we can kind of afford to service it. But when you keep having stimulus legislations, every few years, and when you add that to a large structural deficit already, that does cause a situation where what was already an unsustainable path may become even more unsustainable. And eventually we are going to have to address it. There's a few ways we can address it. One is we can try to inflate it away. That's not likely to be a long-term success. One is we can accept that our debt service is a lot higher for a long time. So a larger share of your tax dollars are going to go for financing the past. That means there's less money to pay for the present in the future. We project that by the middle of this decade, we'll be spending more on interest than we're spending on kids. That's crazy, in my opinion. It's not a fact that it's crazy, in my opinion. Or we may have to do deficit reduction down the line. And the longer we wait, the bigger that deficit reduction has to be because it's spread over a few people. Or we can have a crisis and then we can do deficit reduction down the line. Now, I don't know when these things all start to come due or if they start to coincide together, but it's clear that our long-term path is not sustainable. If you look 30 years out, we're headed for debt that's 2 to 3 times as large as the economy. There's really only one country in the whole world that's been able to sustain something like that and has not had a crisis. And we should be so lucky, I hope. But I also, I wouldn't want to have 30 years of Japan's growth, frankly. The Congressional Budget Office basically estimates on our current course, GDP growth is going to be 0.2% slower per year every single year. 0.2% not a big deal in 1 year. Over 30 years, it's a really huge deal. It really means people's incomes aren't going to grow as fast as they need to. And so we shouldn't be reducing the deficit immediately, but we need to be addressing this sooner rather than later, and gradually and thoughtfully as well. You're on mute, Ben.
Sorry about that. You would think after how many months on Zoom, I know better with Zoom etiquette. So apologies for that. Maureen writes in, the macro picture looks good in the short term, but the macro level distribution of a category like personal income has very real differential impacts on long-term recovery. Existing stressors, investment versus income, employment income gaps, also impact different sectors and regions differently. She's asking, what does the microanalysis look like?
So I'm trying to get to the right graph. I can't tell you all the microanalysis, in part because, frankly, we don't know yet. But I can tell you we have some suspicions. Okay, so we saw that sort of, if I did this by monthly versus by quarterly, you would see a big dip in personal income, basically right when the crisis started, before the checks started going out. And so based on that and a bunch of other clues, we kind of have a sense of what's happening here, which is we think that basically what happened between the first quarter and the second quarter, this 10% growth is actually disproportionately a boost in the income of lower income families, the bottom half, driven by the fact that the checks make a much bigger difference. The checks are cut off at the very top, but even before they're cut off, a $1,200 check is not as big a deal to a family making $140,000 as it is to a family making $20,000. So driven by the checks and the very generous unemployment benefits through July, we actually think a lot of this near-term boost really was kind of middle class and lower income families. And then what happened is that unemployment boost ended. It sort of actually ended a little gradually because the administration replaced 600 with 300. Then it went down to regular employment, which is only 50% replacement. And those checks ran out. And meanwhile, a lot of the chaos in the economy started to become a little bit less chaotic. And it became really clear. If you were a low-income service worker in an area that was, for a restaurant especially, or for other industries that, required socialization to work, you were out of job and your income was down 50%. If you were someone, whose job is on Zoom, like my job is, you were doing fine. You may have even gotten, you may have even be doing better. If you were an investor, you were even doing better. And so what we suspect happened in the third and fourth quarter is all that boost to the low and middle income really started to go away, and probably they went pretty negative. But that was offset by the fact that people in the top half in the top quarter were doing so much better. And so what we guess is that there's actually a lot of income inequality here, where we basically income was about pre-pandemic levels adjusted for where you'd expect it to be. In quarter four, we think we're about 4% up, which is what you would have expected. But it's probably driven by people in the top half and top quarter having much higher incomes and people in the lower half having lower. With this final quarter, what we think is happening is kind of a more normal, more evenly distributed boost. It's not all going to the lowest income like back in the second quarter, nor is it all growing to the highest income. This is probably actually kind of I don't know if healthy is the right word, but the distribution of income, at least by quintile in this first quarter, is probably going to be more reflective of the pre-pandemic than either the second quarter, where we're skewed towards the lower half, or the third and fourth quarter, where we're skewed towards the higher half. The big question is what happens after that. That's the real question. And how fast can the economy recover? How fast can the pandemic end? If it can recover quickly and the pandemic can end, I think what we've seen is a lot of balance sheets are a lot healthier, especially at low to moderate to middle class income. And we could actually see, possibly a broad-based recovery. That doesn't mean every person, every household. There's some businesses that aren't coming back. There's some workers that are going to find new lines of work. But looking, by decile and by class and by area, you could see even recovery. If the pandemic persists and the economy kind of continues to spiral in some ways and we don't have good fiscal policy, then you could see a return to more like quarter three, quarter four, where things are very uneven.
Mark, we're going to get to our final question in a minute, but before we do, I just want to remind folks, you will get a copy of this webinar tomorrow. We hope you will share with family and friends who you think may enjoy it and may want to sign up for a future webinar from the committee. Our final question comes from Patisa, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name. Why aren't people who are claimed on someone else's taxes not eligible to receive any stimulus?
This is a very good question. I'm a little sad this is the last question because I don't have a good answer for you. But the original CARES Act rebates were designed so that a taxpayer and his or her spouse gets a benefit and their child gets a benefit. But a child is basically that's someone that's 16 or younger. And so people that fall in either of those categories, adult dependents, don't get a benefit. There was talk of changing this. It is changed in the Cash Act, which is not passed. I think it's likely they will change it under the Biden administration, even if they don't do the $2,000 checks. But as of now, it's just not the policy. And I don't know the extent to which this was kind of easing momentum. You know, they kept writing off of past pieces of legislation, or the extent to which this was an affirmative policy choice. I just don't really have a good answer for you, unfortunately.
Well, Mark, as always, thank you for walking us through this, and thank you to your entire team for the PowerPoint. For those of you who joined us, we're happy you made time out of your afternoon to participate. Once again, we'll be sending this out tomorrow, and we hope to see you on a future committee webinar. Until then, we hope that you please stay safe and stay healthy. Take care, and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.